In this lecture and the next one, I want to look at two themes of God's relationship with humanity. And the first is God's dwelling place with mankind. And the second, we'll look at God's relationship with his people in terms of marriage. Now, I think it was in the first lecture that I mentioned that God's plan always has been to live with his holy people in a holy place on the earth. And this is actually reflected in a number of ways as we take a look at the comparison between the Garden of Eden, the Tabernacle, the Temple, and the new heavens and the new earth. All of these things show some surprising similarities, and they're not there by accident. Once again, these things show a continuity of God's plan, and it also shows why the study of biblical theology is so important. Because the more we get into the Bible, the more we see the incredible detail that is embedded in the Bible that, again, shows us the awe of God's plan and how he has had one plan from the beginning, which has unfolded over time in different ways and will be consummated in the new heavens and the new earth. So let's begin by taking a look at the Garden of Eden. Now, the Garden of Eden had a number of features that are characteristic of sacred places, particularly of God's holy temples or dwelling places, as we will see later on. The garden, of course, was the unique place of God's presence on the earth. We see that in Genesis 3, verse 8, where it says that God walked with Adam in the garden. Now, the garden was an elevated location, probably a mountain, since from it flowed a river. So, in other words, the garden had to be at a higher elevation so that the river could flow from it. The garden was noted for its gold and precious stones, in addition to abundant vegetation. And that is found in Genesis 2, verses 11 through 17, Genesis 3, verse 22, and also in Ezekiel 28, verse 13. Now, as originally created, Adam and Eve, of course, were holy before they fell into sin. And in Genesis 2, verse 15, it says that God placed Adam in the garden to cultivate it and to keep it. Now, the Hebrew word for cultivate is abad, which means to work or to serve something. And the Hebrew word for keep is shamar, which also means to guard and protect. These two words are found in combination elsewhere in the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, only in passages that describe the duties of the Levites in the sanctuary. In other words, Numbers 3, verses 7 and 8, Numbers 8, verse 26, and Numbers 18, verses 5 and 6. So again, as we will see, already there is a connection between what is going on between the Garden of Eden and what later will happen in the Tabernacle and the Temple. Now, Eden was entered from the east and was guarded by cherubim, according to Genesis 3, verse 24. Now, the word guard in Genesis 3, verse 24 is the same word, shamar, as to keep. God told Adam, you need to keep the garden in Genesis 2, verse 15. Now, this guarding function of the cherubim probably did not involve gardening, of course, but keeping out the sinful and the unclean, which suggests that Adam's original role stated in Genesis 2, verse 15, likely entailed much more than cultivating the soil, but also guarding the sacred space, which is one reason when we talked about the fall into sin and its aftermath, I alluded to this by mentioning that Adam's role was guarding the garden, but he let Satan in, and he let the deceiver in, and he said nothing. So even at the beginning, there's more going on. In other words, since later in the Bible, in Numbers, the phrase to cultivate and keep, guarding, and so on, are used in passages to describe the Levites. That suggests that Adam's role was more than just keeping a shamba or a garden. He had really a sacred role in God's creation. Now, that leads us then to talk about the tabernacle. The tabernacle is talked about in Exodus 25, verse 31, and again in Exodus 35 through 40. Now, the tabernacle was a special tent used by the Israelites as a special place for worship early in their history. It was later superseded by the temple. The design for the tabernacle was given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, when God also gave Moses the Ten Commandments. There was an outer courtyard, which was it was surrounded by a fence, approximately 150 feet by 75 feet in dimension. The tabernacle itself was a tent approximately 45 feet long by 15 feet wide, and it had two main sections: the holy place, which was the outer room, and the inner room called the Holy of Holies. Now, the holy place contained the altar where incense was burned. It contained a 7-branched gold candlestick called the menorah, and a table for the showbread, signifying the presence of God. But the Holy of Holies was the special place, the holiest place in the entire world. The Bible does not give the specific dimensions, but first century Jewish historian says that the Holy of Holies was a cube measuring 10 cubits by 10 cubits by 10 cubits. It was separated from the holy place by a veil or a curtain. Now, the Holy of Holies contained the Ark of the Covenant, also called the Ark of the Testimony, because in it were placed the stone tablets containing the Ten Commandments. And on top of the ark was a lid called the mercy seat, made of gold, with 2 cherubim engraved on it, or placed on there, also made of gold, which faced each other. Also placed in front of the ark were a pot of manna, a portion of Moses' incense, Aaron's rod that budded, and a copy of the book of the law written by Moses when he commissioned Joshua to bring the sons of Israel into the promised land. Now, and so when Israel was wandering in the wilderness, the tabernacle was moved by them from place to place. But like the Garden of Eden, I said that there's a number of connections between these things. And like the Garden of Eden, the tabernacle had several features that denoted its special and holy status as God's dwelling place. The tabernacle was God's special dwelling place on the earth, just like the Garden of Eden was. Tabernacle itself, the word tabernacle, means dwelling or dwelling place. And it was the cloud of God's glory, the Shekinah, which filled the tabernacle and remained with it. We find that in Exodus 40, verses 34 through 38, and Numbers 9, verses 15 through 23. Moses regularly met with God at the tabernacle. And again, the tabernacle was called the tent of meeting. Secondly, the Ark of the Covenant was placed in the Holy of Holies. And the Ark of the Covenant represents the unseen heavenly realities, because the Ark of the Covenant was called God's footstool in 1 Chronicles 28, verse 2. That indicates that God's real throne is in heaven. It's not confined to the earth, but it shows a link between heaven and earth. Now, the cherubim, we saw cherubim guarded the garden. Cherubim were present on the mercy seat over the Ark of the Covenant. Of according to Exodus 25, verses 18 through 22. Yes, they were carved, they were statues, they were golden, but again, we're seeing these same connections. And they are models that represent the heavenly creatures that guard God's true heavenly throne, as we see in Isaiah 6, verses 1 through 6, Ezekiel 10, verses 1 through 22, and in Revelation 4, verses 5 through 9. Now, only the consecrated holy priests of the tribe of Levi were permitted to serve and guard in the tabernacle. And again, that's the same wording of the commission that was given to Adam. The high priest's garments included gold and precious stones. And later on, only the high priest was permitted to enter the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement. So we're seeing, just as the Garden of Eden was characterized by gold and precious stones, so the high priest's garments included gold and precious stones. Now, the tabernacle had several other features that recalled the Garden of Eden. The tabernacle had furnishings including large amounts of gold and silver. Of course, the mercy seat and the lampstand were each made of pure gold. The entrance to the tabernacle was on the east. The seven-branched lampstand, the menorah, was designed to resemble a tree, possibly the tree of life. But of course, the garden had the tree of life, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and of course, all kinds of other trees. The cherubim, recall the cherubim which God placed to guard the way to the tree of life in Genesis 3, verse 24. And the instructions for the design of the tabernacle and the priest's garments were given to Moses on a mountain. So just as the Garden of Eden was on an elevated place, probably a mountain, we're seeing these similarities. The tabernacle itself may indicate, or the design of the tabernacle may indicate that it was symbolically to be a model of the cosmos, which conveys the idea that the whole earth has become God's dwelling place. And in fact, I mentioned first century Jewish historian Josephus. He wrote that every aspect of the tabernacle was made in imitation and representation of the universe. The layout, the veil between the holy place and the Holy of Holies, he says, was embroidered with all sorts of flowers which the earth produces, and other curtains in the tabernacle seemed not at all to differ from the color of the sky. He added that the colors of the veils signified the elements of air, earth, fire, and water, which the ancient people believed that there were the four elements, as did the colors and the composition of the priest's garments. And so, the tabernacle can be regarded as kind of a microcosm or a model of the cosmos. And in fact, later on, in Hebrews 8 and 9 and Revelation 15, verse 5, it specifically said that the tabernacle, and later the temple, was an earthly shadow or copy of heaven itself. Now, the tabernacle, when Israel finally entered the land, and they were in Jerusalem, you'll recall that David wanted to build a permanent structure, a temple for God. And that's when the Davidic covenant was given in 2 Samuel chapter 7. God said, "No, David, you're a man of blood, but your son will build the house or temple for me." And that was done. We see the construction of that in 1 Kings and in 1 and 2 Chronicles. Now, the temple was designed to be a permanent dwelling place for God on the earth, and again, in many aspects, paralleled the Garden of Eden and the tabernacle. The temple became the center of ancient Judaism, and it was the most magnificent building in the ancient world. It was the sole place of sacrifice, and the cloud of God's presence filled the temple just as it had filled the tabernacle when it was dedicated. And we talked about that in an earlier lecture. The entire building was overlaid with gold and was adorned with precious stones. Now, the interior of the temple followed the pattern of the tabernacle with a holy place and a holy of holies, but the size was doubled, and so the holy of holies was a perfect cube, 20 by 20 by 20 cubits, and a cubit is about 1.5 feet, so it would be about 30 feet by 30 feet, 30 feet long, 30 feet wide, 30 feet high, a perfect cube, according to 1 Kings 6, verse 20. The Holy of Holies was overlaid with pure gold, and in the Holy of Holies, there were 2 cherubim overlaid with gold, whose wings touched the walls and met in the middle. The Ark of the Covenant, again, was placed in the Holy of Holies. Now, throughout the temple and its furnishings were garden-like carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and flowers. Lilies and pomegranates decorated the tops of the pillars. So again, we're seeing the same kind of things in the garden, in the tabernacle, now in the temple. We see gold and precious stones. We see these motifs of vegetation. The temple was built on the top of Mount Moriah, also known as Mount Zion, where God had told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And so, again, like the Garden of Eden, the temple was on a mountain. The main entrance to the temple was the Eastern Gate, also called the Beautiful Gate. So, as the special dwelling place of God on the earth, Psalm 78, verse 69 says, "He built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth, which he has founded forever." So again, it was designed to be symbolically a microcosm of the earth or the cosmos. And again, Jewish historian Josephus saw mystical significance in the veil of the temple. Now, Josephus was writing about the temple that existed in Jesus' time. You'll recall that the temple that Solomon built was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. But then when the Jews were permitted to return to Egypt, they rebuilt the temple in about 515 or thereabouts BC, and then it was expanded by Herod and so on. So Josephus was writing about the temple that existed in Jesus' time, but that rebuilt temple was based upon the plan of the temple that was given to Solomon. Josephus writes that the large veil was a kind of image of the universe. This curtain also had also embroidered upon it all that was mystical in the heavens, excepting that of the 12 signs representing living creatures. Now, so what we're seeing here is these things were more than just beautiful buildings or a beautiful tent. There was a lot of symbolism in here that goes back to the Garden of Eden, and as we're now going to discuss, looks forward to the new heavens and the new earth, the new Jerusalem, because all of these things are symbolically saying that they're reflecting God's plan, namely that God's plan always was to live on a holy earth with his holy people. It was to be a holy place. And this was reflected obviously in the Garden of Eden, which was that holy place. And you'll recall that when God gave his commission to Adam and Eve, it was to go and fill the earth, and the commission to cultivate it and so on was still there. Be fruitful and multiply, fill and subdue the earth. In other words, their commission essentially was to turn the entire earth into a Garden of Eden, to spread God's image over the whole earth, because ultimately that was his plan. His plan was to have the whole earth as a holy place for his holy people. And so when Adam and Eve sinned, yes, as we discussed in a previous lecture, they did leave the garden. People have spread over the whole earth, but it has not become a holy place because of the entrance of sin. And that's why when God designed the tabernacle and the temple, symbolically, he wanted to show in symbolic ways the connection between these things and the original Garden of Eden, and his plan that one day the entire cosmos would be a holy place populated by holy people, and he would be in its midst. And so that's why in the middle of the tabernacle, in the Holy of Holies, in the middle of the temple, God dwelt in a special way and was surrounded by all these symbolic things, the gold, the precious stones, the pomegranates, the cherubim, all of these things reflecting the fact that in little model form, they were showing what God's plan was, and they were showing what God's plan would eventually be when it came to consummation in the new heavens and the new earth, which takes us then to Revelation 21 and 22 to see the end of the story. Now, the entirety of the New Jerusalem is a Holy of Holies. And I mentioned this in a previous lecture, but according to Revelation 21, verse 16, the New Jerusalem, and again, don't think of the New Jerusalem as just a city on the new earth. In the book, I talk about different ways, and in our book on biblical eschatology, basically the New Jerusalem is another description of the entire new earth. It's not just a part of it, because the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21:16 is described this way: the city is laid out as a square, and its length is as great as its width. And the measurement of the city was 12,000 stadia. Unfortunately, my Bible converts that into miles and says 1,500 miles, but it's 12,000 stadia. And that number is symbolic. It's 12 times 10 times 10 times 10, or 12 times 1,000. 12 being a symbolic number. Tens are a symbolic number, showing completion and drawing the connection with the 12 apostles and the 12 tribes. 12,000 stadia, its length, width, and height are equal. And so don't think of it don't think of it physically. It's talking about the entire cosmos now. It's not just a literal 1,500 miles or 12,000 stadia. No, the number is symbolic, and it's talking about the entire new heaven and the entire new earth. But what it's doing is going back, and the only other place in the entire Bible where a perfect cube is described is back in the Old Testament, where it described the dimensions of the Holy of Holies, 20 by 20 by 20 cubits. Now, the entire New Jerusalem is a perfect cube. What it is saying is that in the fruition, the entire universe will be a Holy of Holies. And also, just as the Holy of Holies was overlaid with pure gold, so the city, according to Revelation 21:18, the city was pure gold, like clear glass. Just as the Holy of Holies was a special place of God's presence and glory, the city is now the place of God's presence and glory, according to Revelation 21, verses 22 and 23, and Revelation 22, verse 1, and verses 3 through 5. And therefore, only the Holy of Holies, and not the other sections of Israel's tabernacle and temple, not the holy place, not the outer courtyard, is found in Revelation 21. And the reason is that God's special presence in the new earth, which formerly was only limited to the Holy of Holies, is now encompasses all of the new creation. And so, the end is going to be greater than the beginning, because in the beginning, back in the Garden of Eden, the holy place was only the garden. The rest of the earth was uncultivated. But now the entire new creation is going to be like a vast Holy of Holies. The only, back in the Garden of Eden, only holy Adam and Eve could be in Eden. And in the tabernacle and temple, only the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies. But in the New Jerusalem, all of God's people are without sin, and all are in the Holy of Holies, and they will serve the Lord and reign with him forever and ever. And remember, in the tabernacle and the temple, that's the only day, one day per year, that the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies. And he had to offer incense, which formed a thick cloud and covered the mercy seat, so he could not see God's glorious appearance, or he would die. But in the New Jerusalem, Revelation 22, verse 4 says, all of God's people will see his face. And we will be present with him all the time, because God will dwell with us, not just one day per year, but all the time. And so even now in the church, our great high priest is Jesus Christ, who has unlimited presence to the true heavenly temple. And we have unlimited access to God the Father through Christ. But in the New Jerusalem, we will have direct access to God and will always be in his immediate presence. Now, other features of the New Jerusalem show that it consummates the concepts which the garden, the tabernacle, and the temple foreshadowed. Just as God himself planted a garden in Eden, which and gave the plans for the tabernacle and the temple, which corresponded to the heavenly realities. So now the New Jerusalem, it says, comes down to a renewed and restored earth out of heaven from God. Just as Eden, the tabernacle, and the temple were characterized by their gold and precious stones, so, according to Revelation 21, verses 18 through 22, the New Jerusalem is characterized by its gold and precious stones. Just as Eden, the tabernacle, and the temple were characterized by their vegetation, or their garden-like images of vegetation, so the New Jerusalem is characterized by its fruit trees, according to Revelation 22, verse 2. Just as Eden had the tree of life, so the New Jerusalem has the tree of life, Revelation 22, verse 2. Just as Eden was the source of a river, so the New Jerusalem has a river of the water of life, clear as crystal, coming from the throne of God and the Lamb, according to Revelation 21, verse 6 and 22, verse 1. Just as the high priest in the tabernacle and the temple wore an engraving that said, "Holy to the Lord," on their forehead, so in the New Jerusalem, all of God's people will have his name on their foreheads. And just as Eden, in Eden there was no death or sorrow or pain before the fall into sin, so in the New Jerusalem there will be no more curse, no more sorrow, no more death, no more pain. And just as God walked in the garden, according to Genesis 3, verse 8, and filled the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle and the temple with his presence, so in the New Jerusalem it says, "The tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them," according to Revelation 21, verse 3. And so let me conclude this lecture simply by saying, all of these details are not there by accident. This is showing, down to these minute details, from the very beginning of creation to the consummation on the new earth, that God has a plan. He is working that plan, and he's showing that despite our fall into sin, and therefore God's presence was withdrawn from man. He was originally on the earth, but heaven became withdrawn from man. He's never forgotten his plan, and everything he's doing is bringing that plan about. And that's why in the new heaven and the new earth, there's no longer going to be a separation between heaven and earth. Instead, heaven is coming down to the earth. As it says in Revelation 21, verse 1, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, For the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there was no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. And so no longer will there be a separation between heaven and earth. No longer will there be a separation between God and humanity. And the end, he will no longer have to deal with people in symbolic or typological ways, as he did in the tabernacle and the temple. Instead, the whole earth will be a holy of holies. We will see him as he is. He will dwell with us forever, and the end will be far greater than the beginning.